Thank you. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and call this second work session to order on AO 2020-86 and AO 2020-100 regarding the rezone and land use plan amendment for the Adamsville subdivision. Let's go ahead and do a roll call, please.
Miss Allard?
Here.
Mr. Constant?
Here.
Mr. Dunbar?
Here.
Miss Kennedy?
Here.
Miss LaFrance? Mr. Perez-Verdia? Mr. Peterson?
Present.
Miss Quinn Davidson?
Here.
Mr. Rivera?
Present.
Mr. Weddleton? Ms. Zolotel?
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. As a reminder, if members want to get in the queue, either put yourself in the chat or text me if you can't access the chat. So we're going to go ahead and start off today's work session with Mr. Gates. He's going to give us a summary of some of the paths forward as was described at the first work session. And then after that, I will turn it over to either planning or the members if you have any thoughts on those paths forward, or if you've actually done some work and have something for us to consider. And then we can just have an open discussion from there. I also know that potentially, I see that the applicant is here, so if we have any questions for the applicant, I'm sure he could address those. And I also understand we may have some neighbors here who may also be able to address any questions or may have comments about this issue. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Gates.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the different options for the assembly we have here, right? A zoning map amendment, and to accomplish it, we have a comprehensive plan amendment. I'm mostly going to focus on the rezoning here. So I distributed a memorandum that's about rezonings generally, and I'm going to share my screen and show that to you. This shouldn't be new to anybody. Excuse me. Sorry, I don't want to highlight anything. Anyways, so we have here the assembly action. When you have a rezoning before you, you need to consider the department's recommendation, the planning department, which recommended denial, Planning and Zoning Commission, which recommended denial, and public input, and I guess that would be within your packet. And then you have these actions. You can approve this amendment as submitted in the application, and that's what you have before you in AO 2020-100. You can approve the amendment, special limitations, or other modifications. But these need to be at least as prescriptive as those in the application. So the application is for a B3 district. And in other words, you can have special limitations that prohibit uses that would be allowed in the B3 district in code, and that would be at least as restrictive. So you can have restrictions that do that. If there were certain uses allowed in B3 that you want to prohibit here. And then if you do add special limitations, it can be effective only if the written consent of the property owner is obtained. So as we recognize here, this is a single parcel with one property owner. And I need to mention here, though, that one interesting aspect is zoning application. There's notice provided to property owners within 300 feet of the rezone area. And that's provided when it goes to the Planning and Zoning Commission. That notice to those surrounding property owners is not provided when this reaches the assembly as an ordinance that we have here. So, and that's an important aspect to remember here. When you add special limitations, other property owner might consent to them. The people in the surrounding area don't have that opportunity, but they do have an opportunity to protest the approved rezone after the assembly approves it, and I'll get to that in a minute. So that's the second option, allowed in code, approve the amendment, special limitations, or other modifications. And I had a discussion earlier with planning about what other modifications means. And one thought that people had discussed is whether that could mean changing the targeted zoning district from B3 to another one like B1A or B1B. And the general consensus we have is doing that presents a real significant concern with due process. It's sort of, as I mentioned, property owners in the area may not have, it's sort of a bait and switch to them where they had notice of B3 and so forth. And I guess one argument is, well, that might be that a B1B or B1A allows uses, and overall that's more restrictive, or at least that's more restrictive than those that were in the application for B3. However, the whole analysis that's applied by the planning department, zoning districts is very different when you have one as opposed to the other. And I'm going to show you some provisions that sort of highlight that in a few minutes. So the other action is just denying the proposed zoning amendment, just an outright denial, or remand it to the Planning and Zoning Commission or to a committee of the Assembly. So those are the actions. And I had discussed with planning whether a remand to the Planning and Zoning Commission, if the Planning and Zoning Commission could then modify this application as was suggested to change the zoning, targeted zoning district from B3 to something else. And our general consensus is that has that same substantive due process issue, plus the planning department analysis of those zoning districts isn't there. And now one thing to remember is when the assembly is considering which action to take, you need to consider the criteria in section 160E. That criteria is a memorandum down here. The approval criteria 1 through 9, so it's a bit, and a lot of these, I guess, were not concerns here, but the Planning and Zoning Commission referred to these in recommending their denial. One of those is whether the rezoning is generally consistent with the zoning district purpose in the requested zone. E3 and E4 are compatible with surrounding zoning and development. And so when you consider those in terms of doing another modification to change the zoning district, I think that these criteria will come into play, especially for doing the B3. These, I think, are the key provisions that led to the recommendations of denial. So, however, the question is, can the Assembly do these? You can, and I say the big question is whether you should. So code appears to allow this other modification, and even with the B3 district special limitations that add special limitations that really significantly prohibit all these uses allowed in B3 and prohibit them so that it's very similar to a B1A or B1B district. However, that really means, though, that what the Assembly is doing a rezoning that's not really a B3 district in nature, if you do special limitations to that extent. And so I mentioned these points because these provide some risk. Now, rezonings, as you know, we have reminded the Assembly time and again, these are legislative in nature, not adjudicatory. So a denial is not directly appealable on the basis of the denial to the court. However, rezonings are subject to direct challenges on constitutional grounds. So constitutional grounds such as substantive due process, procedural due process, and this procedural due process I mentioned because that might come into play where the surrounding property owners aren't giving notice of this significant change here that might be contemplated, and equal protection issues. So those are grounds that a rezoning could be challenged as a direct challenge to court rather than an appeal of the decision itself. So I hope that makes some sense.
Hey, is that Walker?
mentioned here, and actually I'm not sure, I think I should mention also, one of the options is denying the amendment. And so in addition to these 4 options, the Assembly also has the ability to, this applicant has gone through significant process and incurred significant costs. And there's precedent for an action where rezoning is denied, or generally they've gone through a whole process and they need to start over with the new application. So the planning department can do an appropriate analysis for a significantly different type of application for a different zoning district. And what the Assembly can do in that circumstance is say, well, this applicant's already paid so much, they shouldn't have to pay and start over again. The Assembly can, by an ordinance, waive for an application for this parcel, a new rezone application, waive the fees for it, and thereby give at least the applicant some relief, although they have to start over. So you can do that by an ordinance. And this matter, an ordinance like that, I think is fairly straightforward. And as I said, there's some precedent that we're digging up. And so that's one of the options, is to deny this. And as planning has suggested, have the applicant start over with a new application for a different zoning district, and the Assembly waive the fees for the applicant for that do-over. And an ordinance waiving those fees for up to 1 year could be introduced Tuesday night and acted on at the next meeting. So, and then I guess, while some people might say, well, the applicant's gone through so much already, you need to keep in mind that these are very permanent, long-term changes. And while the applicant has a proposed use in place, as he's described, perhaps that doesn't pan out, in 5 years, maybe financing or other circumstances or whatever. So maybe it doesn't pan out, and 5 years from now, you've still got this rezone in place and all these other uses that some other, maybe it's transferred, and maybe some new owner has some other idea of some intended use that would be allowed in B3. So keep in mind how permanent in nature and long-term these changes are. And then I guess one other potential path forward for the Assembly is, and give me a second here, I'm going to share it for the screen. Almost there. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen showing the code. This is section 20.103.160. So the Assembly actually has the ability to initiate a rezone application. So the Assembly could deny this and initiate thereof. However, talking to planning, nobody's ever experienced this before. It's a rather awkward situation as well. With planning zoning commission members who sort of make the recommendation to the Assembly down the road. They're also confirmed their appointment by the Assembly. So it's sort of would be an odd situation. In addition, if the Assembly is the applicant, you have all these steps here in the application process. And who's going to do that? So suppose the Assembly by majority vote says, we want to initiate an application for rezoning for this area. For whatever 1BA, 1BB, excuse me, or R1A or I'm sorry, B1A or B1B. I guess too much alphabet soup lately here. B1A or B1B. And if the Assembly wants to initiate it, though, you have all these steps here. Who's going to do that? The Assembly has staff. And I don't think we have staff capacity for this. And this are not easy actions. And there's timelines to follow and so forth. And as council, it might make sense for that to be signed to my office. I would argue for funding for outside council to handle it. So keep that in mind. And I felt, though, I'm obligated to inform you about this path forward for you as well, although I don't really recommend that. And I think I've described the various paths. There's a lot of considerations. And I'm reading out to you, though, what the law says you can do. And the big question is whether you should and how appropriate these things are. And to be quite honest, in looking at this, the very cleanest thing to do is a denial and a new application that really has a zoning district that's more in line for all the considerations the planning and the planning zoning commission mentioned, rather than trying to move forward with this B3 and all these adjustments that will be difficult to understand for someone researching this or wanting to develop it in 10 years from now. So with that, I guess I will hand off to the planning department or perhaps some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Did the planning department want to add anything to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is Ryan Yell with the Planning Department. I agree with many of the recommendations that Dean had posed in his evaluation of the situation. I just wanted to point out that some items were requested by the Assembly at the last work session, and that was a list of the allowed uses within the R2M, the B1B, and the B3. That list has been sent to the clerk's office and was distributed to the full Assembly for review prior to this work session. There's also a question specific to the Fire Island Bakery in Fairview and what the underlying zoning for that location was, and that's B1A. I also wanted to point out to the Assembly and make it very clear that early on in the applicant's request, when they met with us for a pre-application conference almost about a year ago, we were very, very clear during that meeting that the Planning Department would not support this request. However, the applicant chose to not modify the request in any way and to go forward with a straight B3 rezoning. I also wanted to clarify a statement that was made by the applicant at the last work session about long-range planning's opposition to this. And I wanted to clarify that again, was not just long-range planning. The Planning Department as a whole makes a recommendation. And looking at the scope of that statement, the Traffic Engineering Department rarely submits comments on a rezone. Watershed Management rarely submits comments in opposition to a rezone because the Planning Department are the land use experts. It would be very inappropriate for them to tell us how to do our jobs just as much as it would be very inappropriate for us to tell Watershed Management how to do their jobs. I would just like to reiterate to the Assembly that the Planning Department does urge the Assembly to agree with the recommendation of the Planning and Zoning Commission and deny the comp plan amendment and the rezone request, and but allow the applicant the ability to come back with a more appropriate request for a comp plan amendment and rezone request in the future. And with that, I have no further questions unless Director McNulty has anything to add.
Thank you, Ryan. This is Michelle McNulty. I have nothing to add at this time.
Thank you. All right, so with that, we're going to go ahead and get into the heart of the matter and see if members have any thoughts based on the advice given. So we'll start with, also want to note for the record, we've been joined by Mr. Weddleton. Start with Ms. Zolotel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions. One is to Dean and whether his last piece of advice there was really based on practicalities or legal limitations. And two, when Mr. Yell says a more appropriate application, if he could be more specific in terms of what he means by that. I think a different parcel, a different request for a different type of rezone, just to provide some context for that comment. I would really appreciate that information. Thanks.
So for that question, to me, that last piece of advice, I guess, was the cleanest way to go about this. That's what you're referring to, correct?
Yes, you had mentioned that it would make more sense to start with a new application, and I was wondering if that advice was just based out of practical concerns or if there are particular legal concerns that we should be made aware of.
I would say, Ms. Salto, that's sort of a mix of both of them. It's practical, it's just cleaner and less messy. But, you know, sometimes the actions can be messy and still be legal. And that might be the case here. the legal concern, though, is, as I mentioned, there's possible constitutional challenges. There's some legal, I guess, procedural and substantive rights for property owners within 300 feet of this area. And if we do, I guess, take action to approve this significant special limitations that really change the character of this B3 with its special limitations to be more like a different zoning district. Well, the neighbors didn't have the benefit of, planning department initial analysis and to object to that. They thought this was B3, and that's what they sort of reacted to when they got notice that this was a B3 application. So there could be some constitutional concerns there. And that's a question of litigation risk. So legally, code appears to say you can do it. And I guess there's some subjectivity to applying that approval criteria in subsection 160E. So I guess that my answer is you could. There may be some legal risk. I'm not sure how to quantify that. But the practical, as a practical matter, it's just cleaner to do it in accordance with planning recommendations, planning zone commission's recommendations. So I hope that this is a sufficient response.
Got it. Thank you.
And then Mr. Yaley, did you want to answer the second question, please?
Through the chair, this is Ryan with the planning department, just responding to Ms. Saltel's second question. In terms of a more appropriate request, I'm going to kind of answer that quite broadly. We can only review the request that's before us, and the request that's before us we've deemed is egregiously inappropriate and not consistent with the comprehensive plans or the intent of a rezone. The planning department was put in quite an uncomfortable position to provide some alternative ideas to the assembly on what would be a potentially less incompatible rezone and comp plan amendment. And we had presented those at the last work session. However, I want to be clear that we are in no way recommending approval or endorsing those recommendations. We were simply passing those forward to the assembly under their direction. But in no way have we said, if you come in with X proposal, we will support it. So I have nothing further to add to that one.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, going to read a comment made by Mr. Constant. I believe a correction about Fire Island Bakery being in South Addition and not Fairview. And the next comment made by Ms. McNulty that South Addition is also B1A zoned. So next I have Mr. Constant in the queue.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Yale said that the bakery was in Fairview. I just wanted to clarify that. The underlying zoning isn't the more important thing. It's where it's at, even though there are two others of those bakeries. But to Mr. Yale, a question. You suggested the recommendation was to vote this down and then allow the applicant to come back with a more kind of tailored approach. So with that in mind, does that go against the recommendation of the Planning and Zoning Commission to do so with prejudice, or can you clarify that for me?
Through the chair, Assemblyman Constant. So the current recommendation from Planning and Zoning Commission is to deny the rezone to B3 with prejudice. So what that would do is that would bar the applicant from applying for a straight B3 rezoning on this property for 2 years, coming back with the exact same request. It would not bar them from coming back and reapplying for a different rezone request.
Okay, so your recommendation that they come back was in following with what the commission recommended, and then have them come back with a substantially different application.
That's correct, and that would be allowed per code.
Thank you. Mr. Weddleton?
Oh, thanks. You know, I just had a question for someone, maybe the applicant, and it's a very, very brief question. What year did you buy the property?
I think it was 18 or mid 17 or late 17 or early 18. I don't remember the exact date. Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you.
So we've been on it for a couple of years now. Yeah.
Okay, and I just, you know, I mean, this is a, you know, the owner has other storage facilities, and I go, it's kind of a neat place for a storage facility in a practical sense. But I've also said, till you're all sick of it, that a rezone is just a rezone. And once it's done, plans can change, it can be sold and so on. And looking at property, and this is just assessed values around the area, but this one is assessed at $4 a square foot as residential, which is typically far lower than you know, business assessments. Right. If the parcel just to the west of it is B1A, which is not as flexible as B3, and that is $12 a square foot. Across the street, there's some B1A, and those go from $9 to $11 a square foot. And the nearest B3 is to the west at intersection with Boniface at $15 a square foot. But, you know, that location on Boniface makes it, you know, more valuable, adds to it. But if you just went with the cheapest B1A across the street, it would add more than double the value of this property and take what's assessed at under $1 million and make it and add another $1.2 million to it. Right. So, you know, this is lucrative to find a piece of property you can rezone from residential to, you know, B3 or B1A or anything like that is money in your pocket. And I've seen that around the city, you know, is that people do that and I'm not saying that this in this case, it looks like this is a family that does storage units and this is a good place for it and that's why they're buying it. But, you know, it can be done speculatively too. So, and doing this rezone, that's what we were opening things up to. And it you know, kind of weighs on me to, you know, lean towards, you know, the long-term planning goals as opposed to, you know, something that it could be anything could happen to this, and it could just end up being a, you know, windfall to someone and not really fit into our current planning, you know, documents. Thanks.
Windfalls to the city because they collect the tax money.
Sorry, Mr. Fuller. So did you have any questions or was that just a comment, Mr. Weddleton?
Well, that was a comment, and I guess just sharing a thought process, and maybe I shouldn't do that at a work session, but
no,
you know,
that's fair. Thanks. Okay, so next I have Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I put the point I wanted to make into the chat, but it goes to what Dean was saying about there being some substantive or due process right that we might be violating by making amendments to turn the B3 rezone into something that is a little more, I like to say channelized, but a little more similar to B1A. And you all received the email from the Northeast Community Council where they basically said that they were generally supportive. There was one person that was opposed, but they were generally supportive, and they had a list of different requirements that they wanted to see. And I believe they're all requirements that the applicant has agreed to. And so I don't think they would violate any due process right from the applicant. For a subsequent purchaser, they of course would be on notice because it would be recorded. And with regard to the neighbors, if we were upzoning essentially from, I don't know, in the other direction, from something that was B1A to something that looked more like B3, I could understand that. But unless I'm mistaken, and I have to confess that I was looking through my email, I didn't see the email where it listed all things could be built in B1A or B3. But I don't think there are many things that can be built in B1A that can't be built in B3. What we're trying to do is make it more restrictive, not less, versus the notice the neighbors were put on by the planning process. That is, all the relevant neighbors received the notice of the rezone. And then, of course, this also went to the Northeast Community Council. And I believe the applicant even went to the neighbors directly themselves. And that was all with the understanding this would be B3, and they got approval or at least very little opposition. Now we're trying to make it more restrictive. So I don't see how the folks that were put on notice of B3 would have a claim that their legal rights were violated by us making it more restrictive. And if we were to amend this, and perhaps Mr. Gates could speak to that.
So if I may, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Yes, I actually had a discussion with some planning staff, Mr. Yell and Ms. Arms, about this. And one thing to remember is it's not just the listed uses. There's also dimensional standards that apply depending on which district it is and the uses that are therein. And so that's very different. And then there is the initial analysis by the planning department, you know, when they look at the application, they look at a B3 application, doing an analysis based on the, I guess, purpose and intents of a B3 district. I'm going to share a document with you on screen real quick for this. So let's see. And these are just excerpts from code here. So these are districts like R2M, which it is currently, and the purposes there. And what this says is very different from the purpose of a B1A district or the B3 district, which, as Mr. Weddington pointed out, is so general commercial, intercommercial centers and areas exposed to traffic. And the B1A and B1B are very different. So the analysis that goes through, which I guess the public and surrounding owners will be aware of, are maybe very different, and understanding what that means for them and the impact on their properties, as well as the dimensional standards and maybe the buffering. And dimensional standards and buffering are not something I've researched extensively, but perhaps Mr. Yell can add to that and why that the differences here might be prejudicial to the surrounding properties.
Can I ask a follow-up, Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
So, I mean, just reading the description you have there, B1A and B1B, it just seems like those are much more restrictive. They require, you know, greater setbacks, less height, that kind of thing, versus B3. And so, again, sort of speaking practically in the real world about what neighbors consider to be potentially harmful to their own property interests, I think you would really struggle to come up with an argument that B1A or B2A or B2B is somehow more damaging or more harmful than B3. Now, I sort of question a lot of the thinking that goes into what people see as a detriment in their backyard or near their property. But even setting that aside, I just, practically speaking, the way our neighborhoods think about different properties and property types, I don't see how you can make a colorable argument that creating greater setbacks. And if you look at the Northeast Community Council's requests, they're asking for you know, greater setbacks, better screening, height limitations. And again, these are things that the applicant has agreed to. And so making the property less generally available to large commercial developers, more like Fire Island or whatever your example would be. Again, I just don't see how there's any substantive harm. But the other question I wanted to ask, let's say that this does. Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Okay. So you know.
Who should go ahead?
Go ahead, Mr. Gates, and then I'll let Mr. Dunbar finish up.
I think, Mr. Dunbar, I mean, you have some interesting, good points, and I think perhaps you see this risk as very minimal, very small. And perhaps I see it as a little more, and obviously planning and planning zoning commissions see this risk as much greater. And one thing I want to point out as well here, though, I'm going to share another screen here with you, just a sec, and it's the list of uses. So this is that handout that was emailed to the Assembly members at their request, comparing the R2M, B1B, and B3. And, this is lengthy, but if you're asking for an amendment with special limitations that, disallow some B3 uses, there's, I think, going down these pages and all these uses allowed and all these different limitations to make it more like B1B. I think that there's a lot of them, and generally you need to look again at that criteria under 160E3. So is this rezoning consistent with the purpose of the B3 zoning district? And if I'm making special limitations that take everything out except for 1 or 2, it's not a B3 zoning district anymore. That's not consistent. I think that's another risk there. So I don't know. I just thought I would show how extensive this amendment you're asking for might be. And I think that might be difficult to finish for Tuesday.
That's fair, but that's different than the point about whether or not we are opening ourselves up to litigation from the neighborhood. But yeah, I mean, I for my colleagues, I have asked for several amendments, one to limit the kind of things that could be built here, others that were asked for by the NECC that deal with setbacks and height restrictions and things like that. And I apologize, I got those to Dean relatively late, so he hasn't been able to draft them, and it'll be difficult to get them done by Tuesday. One question I did have for planning is, if this does get rejected, despite the amendments or whatever process we go through, is there a way that when this applicant comes back through, they could be exempt from certain fees? I know that I've seen that done in past rezones, or I believe I saw it attempted at least early on in my assembly career.
Through the chair, this is Ryan Yale with the Planning Department. Only the assembly has the ability to waive fees. So if the assembly felt it was appropriate to waive fees, they would have to take action on that. The department does not have that ability. But I would also like to point out those fees are generally intended to offset the cost of staff time spent on processing that application. Myself and our staff, we've spent an enormous amount of time on this application thus far. So I don't know. I don't really have a recommendation on the appropriateness of waiving that fee, but the assembly does have the option.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Constant.
Thanks. It's just such an interesting question about whether somebody's rights are taken if we make moves to de facto change the zoning to another zone. And it just, to me, raises concerns about the integrity of the process. And the integrity of the process demands that an applicant applies for what they want, and we're granting them what they ask for, as opposed to twisting it all around. A duck is not a duck is not a duck. A muscovy is not a mallard, and a muscovy is invasive in an area where it doesn't belong. And so that's the concern that is coming to me, that I think the planning department may be right in their concern that the application should be directed to what they're actually seeking, as opposed to using the process to transform a zone through a de facto process into another zone. I have concerns about that.
Thank you. Mr. Yale.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Assemblymember Constant kind of beat me to the punch on that one. If you're going to alter a rezone request, a B3 rezone request with such significant special limitations that it reflects the B1B, make no mistake, you are rezoning to B1B, and you have significantly altered that request, and it is no longer the same request. I do feel that that is a bait and switch to the public. And I do feel that, personally, that is grounds for appeal and protest. We have not only department policy that has set precedents on this before, but we also had an appeal to the Zoning Board of Examiners and Appeals on whether or not a rezone to a different zoning district was substantially the same or substantially different. And the Zoning Board had upheld the director's determination that when you do request a rezoning to a separate zoning district, that does require a new application, and that is a very separate request. So we have some prior precedents these matters, and that does need to be respected and should be accounted for in this decision. So thank you.
Thank you. I want to also read a comment from Mr. Peterson that we have waived fees a couple of times while I've been on the assembly. Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Are there any other questions or discussion on this item? Ms. Zolota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I may, to either Mr. Peterson or Mr. Dunbar, because I do not attend the Northeast Community Council, were there any thoughts about expressed at meetings, if you were there when this was discussed, with regard to kind of the current state of the property? I guess I'm missing that piece of the story at this point.
Before one of them responds, if Peterson would like Donna Mears, who is a resident in the and a active participant in the community council, who might be able to respond to that as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That'd be fantastic.
She also serves on the community council. She'd be on the executive board.
Ms. Mears, if you're on one of those phone numbers, it's *6 to unmute yourself.
I believe I did.
Okay, great. Go ahead. Yeah, so Ms. Zolotl, do you want to restate your question for Ms. Mears?
Sure, Mr. Chair. Ms. Mears, I was wondering if there'd been any discussion at the Northeast Community Council, and I would love your opinion as well, about the current state of the property and what the Community Council has talked about in terms of how it currently is situated.
There has not really been a lot of folks coming out against it about the topic, generally either for or against. General feeling that, yeah, storage would be a good thing here, but the roller rink's been there for 50 years. So the thought of it as, I probably get to speak more for myself in that at the moment we do have an asset in the physical building there. And there are a number of non-residential uses that are allowed in the R2M. But as far as commercial enterprises, they're pretty limited. Does that answer your question?
Yes, that's helpful.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to get in the queue or discuss? Otherwise, I'll go ahead and close this work session, and then this will be back before us on Tuesday, and we will see what path we decide to take. So thanks, everyone. Thank you, Mr. Gates, for the thorough presentation.
Chair.
Detail. Oh, sure. Go ahead, Mr. Dunbar.
He hasn't spoken up, but perhaps, do we have time the applicant might be able to speak a little bit to what was discussed today?
Sure. Go ahead, Mr. Fuller.
Hey, I just really want to thank you guys for your time and effort at this. This is the zoning map that's in the packet. And you can see that 2 blocks to the east is a B1A with special limitations. So that's something that's happened, within the last 20 years or so. The RO office also has special limitations, which is just basically 100 feet to our east and fronting on Turpin Road. So special limitations are not uncommon in this area. This B1A over here is supposed to be limited to 2 acres, but when you take it across the street, it's obviously something that fell outside of the normal B1A zoning requirements, but was able to be approved. So there's been some development over the years. This site, 50 years, has been a commercial site. Somehow it got to be R2M, just like all this stuff was at one point, and has been modified over the years as the demand and the market addressed it. We just want to contribute to the overall area, improve it. business that everybody needs and wants and can use. And we're not interested in changing it to B3 so we can sell it off. Our choice of the B3 was subsequent to our meeting with planning and zoning, in which they indicated that was the zone that would be required in order to do the storage on that size of a lot, because there's limitations on B1A and B1B. So we're totally amenable to what the assembly needs to feel comfortable allowing us to move forward with this project. And once again, 50 years this has been a commercial site. Once we build the storage, it's going to be 50 years before we change it, and it's not going to be us. It's going to be somebody else. But we just appreciate your time and effort and your considerations, and hope that we can move this project forward timely. And we do appreciate the possibility of some fee restructure, as long as there's a zone that we can fit it in. But once again, as my email, we're accommodating to B3 zone with B1B limitations seems the simplest way, but that's up to you guys. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this property frontage is right along DeBar Road. And this is a commercial sector. There's Russ and Jack Plaza just to the west of there that has numerous small businesses in it. That's been there for decades. There's other businesses across the street. The fact that this was zoned for housing and no one has developed it for 50 years, looking at the economic situation we're in right now, our population seems to be declining. We may get more additional updated information depending on what happens with the census. But I have serious doubts as to whether this area will be developed for residential in the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years. I mean, right now it's an empty lot, kind of grows up to weeds. It's not attractive at all. So I think most of the people that I've spoken with about this would have no problem with that being a business, zoned as a business zone. And so whether it's B1A or whatever works out the best, myself and the rest people who live in this area think that is a business type commercial sector. Thank you.
Thank you. So we are quickly running out of time. So 2 final quick comments, and then I'm going to go ahead and close this work session. So Mr. Gates.
Yes, I just wanted to note that table that was provided at the request, the comparing R2 and B1B and B3, the self-storage facilities permitted or conditional in the B1B, so that was another option. I'm not sure whether it would be a conditional use requirement or permitted in this particular site, but planning might be able to speak to that rather than you. But it wasn't just the B3 district that would allow this storage use.
Thank you. Mr. Yale?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to clarify 2 more things. This section of DeBar, specifically this parcel, does not bear a commercial designation in any way under any current plan. It may be perceived as commercial, but it is residential through and through. And every plan, whether that's East Anchorage District Plan, Anchorage 2040, or Anchorage 2020. A statement was made earlier that the population of Anchorage is declining, but that is not consistent with any housing study that has been done in the last 20 years. The population has been shown to be growing. That's consistent across the board. We do not simply look at what is happening today. We need to look at what is happening 50 years down the line, and that's what we base our decisions on. So I just want to be clear to the assembly, the applicant even stated that if they go ahead with the rezone, this is what you're going to have for the next 50 years. The decision that you're going to make on this rezone will be impactful for decades. And it needs to be consistent with the comp plan and the intent of a rezone. So thank you.
Thank you. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and close the work session. We'll see everyone again at 1 o'clock.